So next up we have Catherine Herridge interviewing Senator Tom Cotton. Catherine is the award-winning Chief Intelligence Correspondent for Fox News Channel. She covers intelligence, the Justice Department, and the Department of Homeland Security for Fox News. And in her career, she has reported from Afghanistan, Iraq, Qatar, Israel, and Guantanamo Bay, among other places. I would like Catherine to take over the stage, and here we are.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the Hudson Institute for hosting such a timely discussion and for graciously including me in Fox News Channel, and for Senator Tom Cotton kindly giving up some of his afternoon to be here with us. I'd like to start, Senator, by an overview, kind of setting the table. How do you see Qatar, Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood, how do you see that relationship and that pillar of power playing out in the region?
Well, first, I'd like to thank the Hudson Institute as well. You do great work, and this conference is simply another example of that. And Catherine, thank you for joining me up here for this conversation. So I see the Middle East broadly as a place that's dangerous, and unfortunately has been growing more dangerous in recent years. There are, in my opinion, I'd say three coalitions, three alliances, three axes of power that are fairly stable. The first, and the most important one from the danger standpoint, is Iran and its allies. This is the Shiite axis of power throughout the Middle East. Iran, obviously a nation state with all the powers and abilities of a nation state, is primarily behind that. The remaining actors there are primarily non-state actors. Hezbollah in the Levant, Assad's rump regime in Syria, many of the militia forces in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and other kinds of Shiite insurgencies in Sunni Arab nations. Second would be the Muslim Brotherhood and some of its allies throughout the Middle East. Brotherhood is a whole overarching organization. Some of the terrorist offshoots of the Brotherhood, like Hamas and Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Unfortunately, some nation states that have, to greater or lesser degree, in various ways supported the Brotherhood and some of those aligned groups, like Qatar and regrettably Turkey in some instances. Then finally, our alliance, our coalition of power, the United States, the Sunni Arab nations, and increasingly Israel, increasingly in open fashions. That's the partners that we've had in the region for many years. Obviously, there's some divisions within those alliances, and there's some crossover as well. You know, Iran has supported Hamas, a Sunni organization in the Holy Land. Iran has sheltered Al-Qaeda in the past. It's not to say that these three coalitions or alliances or axes of power never interact at all, but by and large, I think most of the region is divided into three of those coalitions or axes, and we need to do everything we can to try to strengthen ours, to try to minimize support for the other two, and ultimately, in my opinion, try to undermine the gravest threat that we face in the Middle East, which is Iran, more or as much a revolutionary cause as it is a nation state, but a revolutionary cause backed by the power of a nation state.
You've been a tremendous critic of the JCPOA. What are the weaknesses of that deal, and what do you think a good deal would look like?
Well, the weaknesses are manifold. We could spend a long time talking about them. I'll simply say at a high level, the nuclear deal with Iran puts Iran on the path to a nuclear weapon. It doesn't block that path. In a mere 8 to 13 years, Iran will have a nuclear industrial capacity, which means if they don't have a nuclear weapon by then, they will be just a matter of weeks away from obtaining one. And that's only if you assume that Iran is not currently operating a covert nuclear program, which would be the first time they haven't had a covert nuclear program in decades. But in the meantime, until they achieve that nuclear status, which the negotiations were designed to stop them from achieving, not help them to achieve, the deal has also empowered and emboldened Iran. It's empowered and emboldened them because it gave them over $100 million in various kinds of sanctions relief. It continues to help them because they're not facing those sanctions. It helped legitimize them in the eyes of many around the world as at least a semi-legitimate nation state, not an outlaw rogue regime that they are. And time is not on our side. 8 to 13 years may seem like a lot of time in Washington, D.C., but it's the blink of an eye in the life of a nation. And every day that passes, Iran is going to get stronger. Their economy is going to continue to grow if they don't face sanctions, if they're not financially isolated. Western companies are going to get more deeply entrenched inside of Iran, which is going to create a pro-Iran lobby in the capitals of Western nations. Iran's conventional military is going to grow, partly because their economy is growing and they're going to be able to plow more money into their military, but partly because of the nuclear deal, the conventional arms embargo is lifted in barely 3 years, which means Iran can obtain main battle tanks, heavy artillery, attack aviation. And then fourth and final, Iran would have all those things with an industrial nuclear capability in 8 to 13 years. That's why I think we have to confront it now. So the president made the right decision a couple weeks ago when he declined to certify that the deal was not in our national security interests. That's what U.S. law required. It was not simply a question of the technical compliance of Iran with the terms of the nuclear deal, which, by the way, they're not complying with. But there's no doubt in my mind that it's not in our national security interest. So what should we do? Well, I don't think we should immediately reimpose sanctions. That's not a necessary step, and in some ways it's a backward-looking step since Iran has already gotten the benefit of so much of the front-loaded nature of that deal. We should focus on what President Obama should have focused on from the beginning, which is stopping Iran from developing that nuclear industrial capability and confronting Iran's campaign of imperial aggression throughout the Middle East. That means having more robust inspections of Iran's nuclear program to include military sites. That means enforcing strictly the centrifuge restrictions on Iran under the deal. That means including within the purview of U.S. law, UN Security Council resolutions, restrictions on Iran's ballistic missile program, especially ICBMs, which are not known to carry conventional warheads or dynamite. They carry nuclear-tipped warheads. We don't have to sit down with Iran to negotiate any of that, by the way. That's something that can be done as a matter of U.S. law and be done as a matter of UN Security Council action, or at least action in concert with the so-called EU3, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, and all consistent with the explicit terms of the JCPOA as well. We should at least give that a chance. We may not do that in weeks, but we can't wait years. So this is something I'm talking about a matter of months. What we can't do is wait till 2025 to try to resolve all that. And in the meantime, we should confront Iran's campaign for imperial aggression, take firmer action against it and its allies, say Hezbollah and the Assad regime, the Houthis in Yemen, all of whom are destabilizing forces for our interest in the region and for our partners in the region.
What concrete steps could Congress take?
So Congress doesn't have a huge role to play here, in part because existing law gives the president most of what he needs to take these actions. For instance, one reason why I don't think it's necessary to immediately reimpose sanctions on a simple majority vote in the Congress, as U.S. law currently permits us to do for another 45 days or so, is that the president can reimpose all those sanctions themselves. Under U.S. law, he can reimpose them. Under UN Security Council resolution, he can reimpose them because of the way the snapback provision was written. All he has to do is direct his ambassador to the UN to veto the next periodic waiver of them. We can also take more diplomatic and intelligence actions to support our coalition in the Middle East, the central government in Baghdad, and getting them to stop working so closely with Iranian militias, working more closely with Israel and our partners in Lebanon who don't want to see Hezbollah as a state within a state, working with Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis to try to once and for all end the fighting in Yemen, which holds at risk our nationals throughout the Arabian Peninsula, which holds at risk commerce through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Same thing with the Persian Gulf, beginning to take a firmer hand towards Iran's very aggressive action towards our ships and our aircraft and so forth. If we need to take additional steps in Congress, like we did this summer, passing a new sanctions bill that included more sanctions in Iran, also the requirement that the IRGC be designated as a terrorist organization, we can do that. But right now, the president has in his hands under existing U.S. law most of what he needs. And he's obviously taken a much firmer approach with Iran than the last president did.
Have you had recent conversations with the president about next steps?
I have.
Is there anything you can share with us about what that looks like?
I can, but I won't.
I'll give you some time to think about it. Maybe we'll come back to it. Okay. This summer at the Aspen Security Forum, the SOCOM commander, General Tony Thomas, described how Iran had laid the groundwork for what he called the Shiite Crescent. This is a land crescent that extends from Iran to Iraq, Syria, and then also to Lebanon. Do you agree with that assessment? And if so, is there a way to roll back those territorial gains?
Very much so. It's a very dangerous advance that Iran is making through northern Iraq and through southern Syria into the Levant. And their aggression against Israel has become much more widespread. For instance, Iran is now not just providing rockets to Hezbollah, but they're helping to build precision-guided munition factories in Syria on Lebanon's border, where Hezbollah can actually manufacture its own precision-guided munitions to use against Israel if there's another outbreak of hostilities between Hezbollah and Israel. We can't allow that to happen. It's bad enough that it happens by ship, for instance, but we can't allow unmolested the IRGC to have resupply lines going from its territory in Iran into the Levant. So we have to take a firmer line with the central government in Baghdad. We have to work with our partners in the Kurdish regional government up in northern Iraq. And we have to finish the fight off against the Islamic State. It's a good thing that Raqqa fell last week. I don't think that would have fallen if it hadn't been for changes to the rules of engagement and to the delegation of command and control to our military officers, not putting it in the hands of White House staffers. But we can't just assume that that fight is over. The Islamic State still controls territory in eastern and southern Syria, which is vital to Iran and the Assad regime and Hezbollah having that land bridge built. And it's in our paramount interest that we stop it from happening, again, working with our partners in the region.
One of the earlier panels talked about the end state. When you look at the map now, is it really understood that Syria does not go back together, that Iraq does not look like it did a decade ago?
It's hard to see Syria being reunited in a unitary government under the hands of the Assad regime in Damascus, given what the Assad regime, along with Iran and Russia, have done over the last 6 years. I'm not sure we should say it's in our interest either. I think, in Iraq, where we have a lot more influence, we have troops on the ground. We've invested a lot of lives, a lot of money, a lot of time in that country. We need to take a firmer hand in trying to reach a negotiated compromise solution between some of the factions, while also pushing all those factions away from Iran, the IRGC, and the popular militias there.
I'd like to move to Qatar. Can you compare and contrast the relationship between Qatar and the Obama administration and the relationship with the current administration?
I suspect they'd say it was probably better under the Obama administration, in part because the Obama administration was so focused on a nuclear deal with Iran. Again, go back to the 2008 campaign. In the primaries, Barack Obama said that he would sit down with dictators without precondition, and Hillary Clinton mocked him for being naive and foolish. She didn't know the half of it. But he wasn't just talking in the abstract there about some general principle of international relations. He was talking in particular about Iran and about trying to reorder our alliance structure in the Middle East. He admitted as much last year in a notorious interview he conducted with the Atlantic magazine. And therefore, he always ended up siding with Iran's interests in the Middle East, all to get to a deal, then to preserve a deal. So, for instance, when students protested in Iran after the Ayatollah stole election in the summer of 2009, the Obama administration largely stood by. For days, they said nothing. They finally issued a meekly worded statement, not even a strongly worded statement. By contrast, in the Arab Spring in 2011, barely 18 months later, a partner of ours, Egypt, under Hosni Mubarak, faced protests of its own, and the Obama administration immediately threw Mubarak under the bus. A couple months later, they launched airstrikes against Gaddafi. No American friend, but someone who, after 2003, had given up his weapons of mass destruction program because he was scared of the United States power. Therefore, the Obama administration was also looking for ways or looking for partners who would be more friendly towards Iran. There are a lot of countries in the Middle East that are not willing to do that. Qatar was one of them. And therefore, I would suspect that most of the leaders there would say they had a better relationship with the Obama administration than they do under President Trump. They should have a good relationship. There's no reason why Qatar cannot have a very strong, good relationship with the United States. They host our biggest base in the Middle East. We just approved another weapon sales to them. We have a close partnership on many matters. But as President Trump has said, rightly, we need Qatar to come back into the fold of our coalition and stop the support for Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated organizations, stop the close relationship it has with Iran by, for instance, just sending its ambassador back to Tehran a couple months ago after having withdrawn it 2 years ago, along with most, or actually all of the other GCC countries, all but one, I take that back. So we should have a close relationship. I just think President Trump is committed in a way that President Obama never was because of his obsession with the nuclear deal with Iran to telling Qatar to quit playing both sides of the street in the Middle East, to join our coalition once and for all, stop the support for extremist Brotherhood-aligned groups, have a, yes, we understand that Qatar has to have a different kind of relationship with Iran than we do. That's fine. You know, they share the world's largest gas field that accounts for a large chunk of their government revenues. They're close to Iran. We're far from Iran. They're small. We're big. We understand they have to have a different kind of relationship. Just like South Korea has a different kind of relationship with China than we do. Just like Norway has a different kind of relationship with Russia than we do. But that doesn't mean they can't still be a strong ally of the United States.
So how do you get them over to that side of the argument?
I think that you support, by and large, what our Arab partners have been doing. Look, I tend to think the alliance of Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis, Bahrain, and Egypt have taken an approach that is sensible. You don't have to support every single initiative they promulgated. 13 points is a lot of points. Not quite one short of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, but still a lot of points. But by and large, those are our partners in the region that have stood with us, especially in the last 5 or 10 years. And rather than viewing this situation as a crisis to manage, which is the way our foreign policy and national security bureaucracy and establishment tends to view these things, it's just a crisis to manage and get behind us, we should view it as an opportunity to seize. The United States and the GCC would both be much stronger if the GCC was fully united with each other and against Iran.
So is this really for diplomacy versus any kind of congressional action?
By and large, you may have noticed that Congress works on a slow timeline. And in the world, especially when it comes to foreign policy and national security matters, events can overtake you quickly. If the president were to ask Congress to act on this, I would support that kind of initiative. But by and large, it's a matter for diplomacy, some public, some quiet and private. And our president and our senior national security officials should be working pretty aggressively to try to, resolve this as an opportunity to seize, not a crisis to manage.
In 2014, Qatar took the Taliban 5. Was that a mistake? And if so, is it a mistake?
Yeah, it was a mistake by Barack Obama to make that trade. Wouldn't have done that. That's behind us now, though. And I think it's pretty well known now that the president, the U.S. government, asked Qatar to make that decision. Now, again, that's an example of how that country will do some things that other countries in the Middle East would not do. I mean, they opened that outpost for the Taliban there. That was not the kind of arrangement that I ever would have advocated for. But it's behind us now. It's hard to see on what grounds you would unwind it. We should certainly insist upon the very thorough enforcement of the terms of confinement, travel, communication on the Taliban 5, to which Qatar agreed. And if they don't enforce those terms, then we can revisit the matter now. But I'd sooner see things like Qatar change its behavior towards Iran and towards the Muslim Brotherhood and some of the other associations it's had with the Taliban or Hamas in the Holy Land than try to revisit that 3 years on.
Final point on the Taliban 5. There really is, though, evidence of re-engagement with the Taliban 5 and their followers in Afghanistan.
If that's the case, I think there's a lot of empty beds left in Guantanamo Bay.
On the issue,
Be like a homecoming for them.
on the issue of Qatar, is there a way to? As Director Panetta said earlier, they've really been effectively able to play both sides of this argument. Are they able to do this because they feel emboldened in the region? And if so, what do you put this down to?
Well, the ability to play both sides is in part because the Obama administration allowed them to play both sides for some period of time. I think the president is committed to stopping that. So President Trump is committed to stopping that. Some elements of the Trump administration may have a different viewpoint, especially if they worked on this file in the Obama administration. But ultimately, we're the biggest, strongest, richest, most powerful nation in the world. And if we want a country like Qatar to not play both sides of the street, to get on our side of the street once and for all, which, by the way, is not just in our interest or the GCC's interest, it's in their interest in the long term too, we have a lot of tools to make that happen, and that's what we should focus on.
To what extent has their support for terrorism in the region and outside of the region changed in the last few years? Has it, in fact, grown?
Well, I think over the last 6 years since the Arab Spring, it's been unhelpful in the region in particular. And again, just to go back to kind of the intellectual forerunner of so many of these movements in the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas is a terrorist offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Holy Land, and they've provided some support for Hamas in the Holy Land. If they weren't doing that, if Hamas didn't have that kind of outside support, it'd be much harder for them to hold on to power. And the kind of second-order effect that would be in everyone's interest if Qatar came back fully within the fold of the GCC and the United States-led coalition. A weakened Hamas means a greater chance for some incremental progress between Israel and the Palestinians, because you don't have a terrorist organization controlling the organs of a state in Gaza. You don't have the kind of rivalry between Hamas and Fatah for control and influence of that. That's just one example of how you'd have second-order effects of Qatar coming back fully within our camp if the U.S. government and our allies can make that happen.
To a certain extent, is having an unstable environment to their advantage, though?
I would say when you're that size of country, it's never good to have an unstable environment in that region. Ultimately, again, the United States has the ability to kind of not necessarily dictate events, but help direct and channel events there. And we should exercise that ability to a greater extent than we have. Qatar is a small state. It has maybe the highest GDP in the world. If it's not the highest, it's one of the highest, after, Liechtenstein or Luxembourg or something. There's no reason why its people cannot live, in peace and prosperity and security aligned with the United States and many of its neighbors. That's why I say that in the long run, some of the actions it's taken in recent years are contrary to its interests.
What would some of those actions be? More specific.
Yeah, support for organizations like the Taliban or like Hamas. It's deeper relationship with Iran than we would like, acknowledging that it needs to have a kind of relationship the United States or Saudi Arabia might not have, but deeper than we would like. Again, these are things that can change, and they don't take a long time to change, and they ought to change.
Mm-hmm. The Muslim Brotherhood, is it a greater threat today than it was 5 years ago? And if so, why is that so?
Well, it's a threat. It's an organization that's founded on anti-American, anti-Western, violent, theocratic ideas. And some of its offshoots, like Hamas, are outright terrorist organizations. I think in some ways it's stronger. In some ways it's weaker. You had a Brotherhood-aligned government in Egypt that proved that it could not govern in any way, and therefore it's lost some credibility, I think, as a movement that was capable of turning itself into a governing power. But in other ways, a lot of the offshoots, the descendants of the Muslim Brotherhood as an intellectual movement, are still strong. The Islamic State may be defeated in Raqqa, but like I said, it still controls some territory in Syria and Iraq, and it still has its online caliphate. AQAP is not yet defeated. Many of these Sunni extremist groups in the mountainous tribal areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan are strong and resurgent. So in some ways it's been weakened, but in some ways it's still quite strong.
To what extent, while we're talking about ISIS and the caliphate, as it is near collapse, what are the second-order effects, let's say, in Africa? We've been talking about Niger this week. Were you aware that U.S. forces were in Niger, and how would you describe the threat in that region?
So first, I was aware. I mean, you could go to African Command's website and find that they had troops there. Or second, if you're on the Armed Services Committee, you could attend our hearings and hear the testimony that we had troops there. I mean, if you ask the question, does the United States have troops in this or that country, the answer is almost always yes, to a greater or lesser degree. Sometimes that may number in the dozens, sometimes it may number in the hundreds or thousands. But you know, in Africa, where you've seen both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State trying to establish footholds to have what they had in Afghanistan 17 years ago, which is a safe haven from which they can deliberately plan, plot, and then launch attacks against the United States. We don't want to let them have that. That doesn't mean that we have to see in Africa what we saw in Afghanistan 16 years ago. It means that we want to try to empower and train the local forces to deal with these insurgencies, oftentimes which are ethnically, tribally, historically rooted, but then end up swearing fealty to organizations like the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. So as the actual caliphate falls, I think one fear is that you may see growing numbers of Islamic State cells in places like Africa or Afghanistan or around the world, and you might. It's possible you could see some of the most dangerous foot soldiers or high commanders of the Islamic State escaping Iraq and Syria and getting into some of those new safe havens in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, or Africa.
So the goal in Niger was to effectively try and keep a lid on the Al-Qaeda operatives in that part of the world, right?
I think that broadly speaking, it's fair to say that's one of our main goals in Africa. I mean, that's largely why we have an Army Special Forces, also known as the Green Berets, created by JFK specifically to deal with these kind of local insurgencies. Much better to deploy a 12 or even 6-man team of Green Berets that is not going to be kicking down doors and pulling triggers themselves as a primary mission, but rather training the indigenous armies of those nations to do so. That's one of the reasons why we have troop presences in so many places around the world. So it's a fair characterization to say one of the core missions we have in Africa is that kind of train and advise mission, which again, the Green Berets have had as their primary mission for over 50 years now.
Without getting into classified information, based on what you know, does everything tell you that this has the hallmarks of an Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb attack, or does it point to ISIS?
I think I'll go back to my previous answer on I could tell you, but I won't.
Okay.
And I mean, obviously they use a lot of the same tactics, techniques, and procedures, and are vying for a lot of the same territory. And sometimes, again, those local forces oftentimes are deeply rooted in a tribal and ethnic and historical way in that territory, and they can shift between external terrorist organizations based on who's up, who's down, who can provide them the most money or weapons or equipment or fuel or what have you. They're both pretty bad, though.
We have about 6 or 7 minutes left, and before I get to some closing ideas, I have a couple of questions which I'll put in the category of, now that I've got you in the chair right there. What can you tell us about any conversations to leave the Senate and go either to be CIA director or the movement of Pompeo to Secretary of State?
Very little. I've seen the news reports to which you refer. I think much of that is idle Washington parlor game speculation. We have a CIA director, Mike Pompeo. I think he's doing a pretty good job. He's a very close friend of mine, and I support him in the work he's doing. These decisions are up to the president. They're not up to senators beyond our constitutional authority to confirm or not confirm his nominees when those nominees are submitted. And as far as I know, his dance card on the National Security Council is full right now.
Okay. And on Russia, as a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, have you seen anything that's helped you determine how credible this Trump dossier has been?
Well, I think some of the key points about its credibility are unknown. As Senator Burr said at a press conference a couple weeks ago, as anyone who's followed the matter closely knows, I mean, this outfit here in Washington, D.C., Fusion GPS, has gone to the greatest lengths possible to try to conceal who paid them, which makes me think it was probably a Democratic political operative or Russian intelligence service. Right now, I mean, you've got their employees or officers who have taken the fifth in front of the House of Representatives and are now fighting in the district court here to quash a subpoena of their bank records. I mean, they have a constitutional right to take the fifth. We have a common sense right to draw what inferences we will from that. Likewise, I don't think we know anything about who the source is for this document is. I mean, this former MI6 officer, about whom we know little, Chris Steele, I don't think was running around Russia interviewing people who claim to have firsthand knowledge of any of these outlandish allegations. So for all our knowledge, we could be dealing not just with sources, but subsources whose identities, we don't know. Mm-hmm. And for that matter, who are being paid to provide salacious information, or if they were officers of Russian intelligence who were tasked to provide that information. So I think you can't give any credibility to it at this point. Certainly not until we answer those questions, nor have I seen any reason to do so.
To the matter at hand, the Muslim Brotherhood, Iran, and Qatar, as you look ahead in the short to medium term, what kinds of developments will you key in on to determine whether we're heading in the right direction or we're heading in the wrong direction?
Well, I think some obvious incremental steps would show good progress. So, for instance, recalling their ambassador from Tehran, maybe a change in the tone of coverage on Al Jazeera every now and then. Maybe a greater willingness to sit down and talk with the other leaders of the GCC about I think it's now 6 principles they'd like them to endorse. Some of these matters, again, are not big steps, but they'd be steps in the right direction, and they might lead to steps that are more consequential, many of which are going to be classified, of course, but would show that, of the three powers in the Middle East that you just identified, one of them is fully back within the fold inside our coalition. It's going to be pretty hard to do that with the Muslim Brotherhood and its aligned organizations or with Iran, so I'd like to do it with Qatar. I think it would strengthen us and it would strengthen them and all of our partners and neighbors in the Middle East.
Building that relationship with Qatar, is this a way to sort of divide, isolate, separate Iran or weaken Iran? Is that?
Of course, yeah. I mean, look, again, Iran is as much a revolutionary cause as it is a nation state. Unfortunately, it has the powers of a nation state behind that revolutionary cause, and you see the consequences of it everywhere. You see it in Iraq, you see it in Lebanon, you see it in Syria, you see it in Yemen, you see it on the seas. It is not in the United States' interest to have a revolutionary cause backed with the powers of a nation state expanding its influence throughout the Middle East. Therefore, we need to identify every partner we can who is willing to work with us to contain and ultimately roll back that influence. Qatar could be one of those partners. They can certainly be a better partner than they have been.
When you were speaking about the JCPOA, you said 8 to 13 years. Is there a point at which there's almost no return, or do we have the kind of visibility that we need to know when we're approaching that point?
Well, again, if Iran doesn't have a covert nuclear program, which I hope they don't, it would be the first time in decades they have one. And to think about that in very concrete terms, I mean, you're talking about a country that's 2.5 times the size of Texas, in which you're looking for facilities that are not much bigger than this hall in which we're sitting. And the people looking for them are, a handful of Scandinavian or Japanese scientists who are being driven around by Iranian intelligence officers. I mean, that doesn't sound like a recipe for success in ensuring that they don't have a covert facility. Now, their declared facilities is a different thing, but a lot of their facilities that are declared are military, and we don't have the ability to inspect them. But ultimately, if the terms of the JCPOA are all that governs Iran's nuclear program, they will have an industrial capability in 8 to 13 years. And I do not think we can allow that to happen, both for what it would mean once Iran gets nuclear weapons and what it means in the interim, just as we've seen in the 2 years since they enacted that deal. And I would say, too, I mean, it's not a coincidence, in my opinion, that North Korea's pace of missile and nuclear testing has accelerated rapidly since the JCPOA was consummated in the summer of 2015.
And why do you think that is?
Well, it showed that the United States was willing to strike a very bad deal, even worse than the deal we had with North Korea in 1994, for any kind of fig leaf of a claim that we had pushed their nuclear program to the right on the calendar. And therefore, if the Obama administration was willing to appease Iran to such a degree, I think Kim Jong-un calculated that they would be even more deferential towards a country that already had nuclear weapons.
And how engaged is the president on these issues?
Very engaged. I mean, he's a commander-in-chief. It's his foremost responsibility. He understands that. I think he gets a daily brief. Every day he's in Washington with Mike Pompeo. I know.
But without getting into what you talked to him about, I mean, how would you describe his level of engagement?
It's deep. I mean, when we have conversation about this, he understands at a detailed level, what the threats are coming from countries like Iran, like North Korea. That's one reason why he declined to certify that the nuclear deal was in our national security interest. It's no secret that a lot of the members of his cabinet disagreed with that, but he went with his instincts this time around. And I think that's in part because he understands just how grave those threats are. And plus, when you sit in that seat versus any of the other seats at the National Security Council, you tend to see things in a slightly different perspective.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to give you the final word.
Thank you for the interview. Thank you for the interview, and thank you to the Hudson Institute for, again, hosting an important conference. The Middle East right now, as I said, is a dangerous region, more dangerous even than it normally is. We have some advantages in the Middle East with our allies, countries like Israel and Jordan, Egypt, the GCC. We should press those advantages to try to rebuild the security order there that have served us pretty well over the last 40 or 50 years or so. And I would say that starts first and foremost with recognizing that Iran is the source of most of these challenges in the Middle East, and therefore anytime we have a chance to separate a country like Qatar from Iran and bring them back within the fold, we should take that.
Senator Cotton, thank you. Thank you to all
Catherine.
of you and the Hudson Institute as well. Thank you.